This is Pre-Algebra Lesson 5-3, adding and subtracting fractions. Remember, when adding or subtracting fractions, all fractions need to have the same denominators, otherwise known as the common denominator. The sum or difference is the sum or difference of the numerators. The denominators will not change. So, if you have like denominators, to add or subtract them, you just keep the common denominator and add or subtract the numerators. For example, if we have 4 9ths plus 2 9ths, we already have the common denominator of 9, so I can leave the common denominator of 9, and I simply want to add my numerators because we're adding, so it'll be 4 plus 2. So that would become 6 over 9, and 6 over 9 will reduce because I know 3 will go into 6 twice, and 3 will go into 9 3 times, and I end up with 2/3. And it does not matter if your denominators are numbers or letters. For example, 12 over b minus 5 over b. The common denominator is still b, and I'm doing 12 minus 5. Well, 12 minus 5 is 7, so the answer to this is 7 over b. Keep the common denominator, add or subtract the numerators. Now, before you add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators, you first must write those fractions with a common denominator. It's easiest to find the lowest or least common denominator. However, the method below will give you a common denominator every single time. It just may not always be the lowest common denominator. For example, if I have 2/3 plus 1/5, I can have a common denominator of just multiplying the 3 and the 5 together and get 15. In this particular case, it is the least common denominator. So if I just took 2/3 and multiplied it by 5 over 5, and I took 1/5 and multiplied it by 3 over 3, I would get 10 over 15 plus 3 over 15, which makes 13/15. Algebraically, a over b plus c over d, my common denominator is going to be b, d. So I take a over b and I multiply it by d over d, and I take c over b and multiply it by b over b, and I get a d over b d plus bc over bd. Common denominator is bd. And I just add together AB plus BC, and since none of those are like terms, we just have AD plus BC. All right, so we're going to simplify these, finding each sum or difference. I personally do not like to do things horizontally. I'm a vertical type of person. I like to take my fractions like 1/6, and I'm going to subtract from that 3/4, because I can get my common denominator right next to my fraction, and it helps my poor little brain to keep things straight. I could multiply 6 and 4 together and get the common denominator of 24, but that's not the lowest common denominator because I also know that 4 times 3 is 12 and 6 times 2 is 12. So my lowest common denominator would be 12. In order to get to 12, I have to multiply 6 times 2, so I have to multiply the numerator by the exact same thing. 1 times 2 is 2. 4 times 3 is 12, so I have to multiply my numerator by 3. 3 times 3 is 9. And then I just subtract. And paying attention to signs, 2 minus 9 means I'm going to have a negative fraction here. And yes, you can have negative fractions, just like you have negative decimals and negative whole numbers. 2 minus 9 is -7, so I have -7/12. I would encourage you to write things vertically because it is easier to keep track of all of your work. Problem number 2, 2 over y minus 5/16. So I have 2 over y, and I'm subtracting that 5/16. Common denominator between 16 and y is 16y. There's no shorter way of just multiplying the two numbers together. 2 over y has the y, it needs the 16, so I'm going to multiply by 16 over 16. 5 over 16 has the 16, so I'm going to multiply by the y over y. So I end up with 2 times 16, which is 32, and 5 times y, which is 5y. Now, 32 and 5y are not common terms, so I really can't subtract them. So I end up with 32 minus 5y is just that, 32 minus 5y over my common denominator of 16y. Nothing can be simplified here. Don't say, oh, I can get rid of those y's. You cannot, because there's a plus or a minus sign. Okay? You cannot get rid of the y's because essentially you have two fractions that are over y's and you can't get rid of them. So this way is the only way to do this. The only way you could get rid of those y's if the 32 also had a y, which it doesn't because then we can combine it and get a like term. Now, Now, there are two methods for adding and subtracting mixed numbers. You can transfer each mixed number into an improper fraction, or you can leave the mixed number and borrow if necessary. I don't care which method you choose as long as you understand why they work the way that they work. For example, I'm going to take 3 1/2 and I'm going to add to that 1 1/4. Okay? If I was going to change them to improper fractions, okay, that's method number 1, is changing it to an improper fraction. Well, as an improper fraction, 3 1/2 is 7/2, and 1 1/4 is 5/4. Common denominator between 2 and 4 is 4. Now 5/4 already has a 4, so I'll just leave it alone. 2 times 2 is 4, 7 times 2 is 14. So now when I go to add these, 14 and 5 is 19 over 4. And then I can transfer this back to a mixed number. 4 goes into 19 4 times, with 3 left over, so 4 3/4. Remember, 4 goes into 19 4 times 16. And this is my remainder, so that's my numerator, and this is my divisor, so that's my denominator. So it's 4 3/4. Method number 2 says we can keep our mixed numbers. So I would have 3 1/2, and I'm going to add to that 1 1/4. Common denominator would still be 4, so I'm going to keep my 3, I'm going to keep my 1, make my common denominator 4. So here I have 1 1/4, 2 times 2 is 4, still, 2 times 1 is 2, and then I would just add like normal. 3 plus 1 is 4, 2 plus 1 is 3, and I get 4 3/4. You get the same answer regardless of which way you do it. The only problem comes in when you start to do subtraction. If you start to do subtraction, you can get some interesting answers if you're not very careful, especially when you have negative fractions. Let's practice a couple. We have 5 3/4, and we are going to add 7/8 to that. Okay. I'm going to keep the mixed number just because it's easy enough to do. So 5 3/4 plus 7/8. Common denominator is 8, so I'm going to keep my 5, make this an 8, and I'm just going to keep this fraction just as I see it. 4 times 2 is 8, 3 times 2 is 6. So I have 5, 6 and 7 is 13/8. I cannot leave this as 5 13/8 because 13/8 is an improper fraction. So this is the same thing as saying 5 plus 8 goes into 13 one time with 5/8 left over. So it's 5 plus 1 and 5/8, so it becomes 6 and 5/8. Okay. If I have 5 2/3 minus 3 1/6, okay, again, I can keep my mixed numbers. So I'm going to keep 5 2/3. And I'm going to subtract from that 3 1/6. Common denominator is 6. So 5, this is 6, multiplied by 2, multiplied by 2. So this is 5 4/6, minus 3 1/6. 5 minus 3 is 2. 4 minus 1 is 3. 2 3/6 can reduce to 2 1/2. And I'm done. Now that works really, really nicely. Okay. You have to be careful, however, when you start to get into positive and negative numbers. When dealing with positive and negative fractions, it's often easier to subtract negative fractions and mixed numbers by first translating them into improper fractions. This way your negative signs won't get lost, or you won't forget to borrow properly from your whole number. Because a lot of people don't remember to borrow properly from the whole number, and it can get really, really ugly. So when it comes to positive and negative fractions, I have a tendency to make them into improper fractions. It's just easier. So if I have negative 5/8 plus 1/4, okay, those are already regular fractions, so I don't have to worry about that. Negative 5/8, and then add to that 1/4. The common denominator between 8 and 4 is 8, so I'm going to keep this. 4 times 2 is 8, 1 times 2 is 2. So I have negative 5 plus 2. Negative 5 plus 2 is positive 3, so I have 3/8. That one was very simple. And it should be negative. So, number 2 here, negative 5 1/3 plus 4 3/5. I'm going to change both of these into improper fractions because I don't want to have to deal with this negative sign because borrowing is going to get really ugly with the negative. So I have negative 5 1/3, and I'm going to add to that 4 3/5. But I'm going to change them both to improper fractions first. So that's going to be 5 times 3 is 15 plus 1 is 16, so it's negative 16/3. And over here, 4 times 5 is 20, plus 3 is 23, so I have 23/5. Common denominator between 5 and 3 is 15, and I'm going to move into this next problem, which means I'll move problem 3 a little lower in a second. So my common denominator is 15. 15 times 5 is 15. 16 times 5 is a negative 80. 5 times 3 is 15, and 23 times 3 is 69. Okay, now I have an easier number to deal with because I have negative 80 plus 69. Okay, so negative 80 plus 69 is negative 11, so I have negative 11/15, and I am done at this point in time. Much easier to do as an improper fraction than it is as a mixed number. You do not want to try to do that problem as a mixed number because it can get really ugly. I'm just going to move number 3 down further. It's 4 5/6 minus 7 3/5. So I'm going to move that down here where I can work with it a little bit better. So I had 4 5/6, and I'm going to subtract from that 7 3/5. Notice 7 3/5 is larger, so my answer should be negative. And I really don't want to have to try to do borrowing, because borrowing can get really ugly with fractions. So I'm just going to change both of these to improper fractions first. 6 times 4 is 24. 24 plus 5 is 29, so I have 29/6. Here, 7 times 5 is 35. 35 plus 3 is 38, so I have negative 38/5. Common denominator between 6 and 5 is 30. So I'm going to make both of these 30ths. 6 times 5 is 30, so I'm going to multiply 29 times 5, which will be 145. 5 times 6 is 30, so I'm going to have to multiply negative 38 times 6, which will be negative 228. Now I have 145 subtract 228, because it's negative minus 7 and 3 goes 2. So 145 minus 228 is, let's see here, 45, 2 minutes, 55, 83, negative 83/30ths, which I can change to a mixed number. 30 goes into 83 twice, so negative 2 and 23/30ths. The more you work with fractions, the better you get at them. Fractions are incredibly important. I find that when my higher level math students have trouble, it's because they cannot deal with fractions because they didn't practice them enough when they were younger. So if I can encourage you to do anything is practice your fractions now so that when you get older and you have to use them in more complex ways, the fractional parts won't trip you up.